So, the artwork that I wanted to choose for this interview is the Costa painting, which is included in the colonial section of the Resistance Cannot Be Stopped project. And this particular painting, and all of the others that were produced within the context of Costa paintings, really resonated with me when I was in college. And I feel that I can't really talk about the Costa painting without talking a little bit about where I come from and who I am and what my personal connection is to it. So I identify as a brown Cuban Jew. And what that means is that my father's side of the family is Jewish American, and my mother's side of the family is Afro Cuban. And so I consider myself mixed, right? Latina, person of color. I also identify as Jewish, so many different identities. And growing up, I grew up in a predominantly white community, and I was raised completely Jewish. I went to Sunday school from age 4 until 12th grade. I went to BBYO. I was very involved in the Jewish community, and that's really all I knew about who I was. Jewish culture and Jewish history was something that I was exposed to basically from as early as I could talk and learn. But I knew virtually nothing about my Cuban side of the family. And my mother is an immigrant. She came here to the United States when she was 12 years old, along with her siblings. They lived in an orphanage for several years before their parents were able to make their way out of Cuba and emancipate them from the orphanage. Then they went to Puerto Rico, lived there for a few years, and so they had a very arduous and difficult journey of getting to the United States. But in terms of what I knew about Cuban history, Cuban culture, it was extremely limited to what I knew at home. I knew a little bit about Cuban food. I knew that there was a bad guy named Castro, right, was responsible for why my mother and her family is here. But beyond that, I had no clue about who I was, right, especially on that side of the family. And not only that, my parents' marriage was very controversial at its time. My parents were married in 1980 and they had me in 1982. When they were first getting married and getting to know each other, there was a lot of resistance on the side of my father's family. And in this case, I'm not using resistance in a positive way. But what I mean by that is that many members of his family, my dear grandmother included, felt that their marriage should not happen, right? And the way that they framed that was that they felt that he, as a Jew, should only marry another Jewish woman. But really what the larger subtext was that they were not okay with him marrying a brown woman, right, with 2 kids from a previous marriage. To the extent that many members of the family threatened to sit Shiva, which basically means in the Jewish tradition when you are mourning the death of someone. And so they were going to disown him and mourn his death as if he were no longer part of the family if he married my mother. They did it anyway, right? And I also heard stories about my grandmother, and this is very hard to reconcile because I loved her very much and she was very good to me. But one of the things that she said to my father before he got married to my mom was, "I will never forgive you if you give me a black grandchild." And that, I think, speaks to a lot of the racial tensions that were at play in terms of my parents' marriage. And growing up, I internalized a lot of these ideas about, back then the term was Hispanic, right? Then it was Latino, now it's Latinx, but I'm just going to use Hispanic because that's the term we grew up with. But I had a lot of internalized racism about my Hispanic side or about Hispanic culture. I felt like there was no such thing as Latin American history. I didn't know anything about myself. And I remember growing up feeling like, if only I was completely white, like I would be smarter, or if only I was completely white, I would do better in school. And, these are really damaging stereotypes that I had absorbed from, I guess, the environment that I grew up in. I didn't really know where they came from, but I knew that I felt that that was not something to celebrate, not something to learn about, but rather something to keep under wraps or something to hide. And so the whole reason why I bring up the Costa paintings is because I saw one when I was in college for the very first time. And for the first time, I saw a representation of a mixed race person in art. And I did not know that this phenomenon of interracial marriage was a thing, before the 20th century. I had no idea. So for me to see the historical legacy that I come from reflected in a painting, and to see a painting of someone who looked like me, as problematic and as racist as these Costa paintings are, it was a very powerful moment for me, because it made me realize that my existence is not just happenstance, or that there's something weird about being of two cultures, of two races, two ethnicities. But as a matter of fact, people in history have been struggling and struggling to identify themselves through these binaries for hundreds of years. And there was something incredibly empowering about recognizing myself in an image, and knowing that there's a history there, that there's something to learn. So in terms of how Costa paintings connect to the bigger picture and to these more universal histories, I think that something that makes them very interesting and unique is that they're showing really the origins of modern day conceptions of race and of miscegenation. And I think a lot of times we think about race as being a social construct born of the 19th century. But in fact, Costa paintings and many other artworks like them are showing us a very early glimpse into the construction of racialized hierarchies. This is where we start to see histories of the universalization of anti-blackness and the universalization of anti-indigenous sentiments. And so what you see in the Costa paintings is very paradoxical, because they're very aestheticized, they're visually pleasing, but they're also telling these very violent histories, right, of probably rape, of unequal power dynamics, of coercion, of people who are being placed into these categories that determine the contours of their very lives based on skin color, hair texture, and physiognomy. But I think that maybe we can also read resistance in them, because people, despite the frameworks that were imposed on them from the 16th century onwards, were constantly negotiating a space within these very rigid hierarchies. People found a space of existence, they found spaces of resistance. We have evidence of that not only in paintings, but also in historical documents, right? Of people who purchased their freedom, of enslaved Africans who purchased their freedom, of indigenous and Afro-Indigenous people who set up maroon communities, which were these communities that were outside of the jurisdiction of Spanish colonial rule. You have examples of mixed race people who were fighting alongside their indigenous and black compatriots during anti-colonial uprisings and rebellions. And so you can start with the Costa painting and look at these representations. And even though the paintings themselves are telling us a very limiting story of hierarchy and power, we can think of them as a starting point for how people were also constantly pushing back against those power structures. I think artists can do the important work of forcing conversations that need to happen. I can give maybe an example from the discipline of art history. I think that it's actually artists who are engaging with early images of slavery or early archival images of maps, and who are using these archival documents in very creative ways that are forcing us to confront the colonial legacies that we live with in the 21st century. And I think because of the creative work that artists do, they can help bring conversations into the public forum that need to happen, especially in these times of political crisis. And so I think the artist's role really can't be understated. I think if we think too, if we look back in history and we look at the systematic repression of artists within authoritarian regimes, or in contexts of colonialism, or in context of imperial rule, artists have very regularly been suppressed. They've been censored, brutalized because of that vision that they have, and because artists are asking the hard questions and dealing with difficult subjects that people in positions of power don't always want to recognize. So I'm drawn to Latin American art for very personal reasons. And when I was an undergraduate, learning about these histories for the first time was an extremely liberating and eye-opening experience. And so whenever I teach these histories in my classrooms, and when I engage with students in them, I bring a lot of myself into this work, and it's intellectual work, but it's also very emotional and very personal. Especially when you're teaching something that you're a part of, and you see images that resonate with your experience, that resonate with the experience of your family or of your culture, that can be empowering and also very difficult. And I think that it's very important to expose these histories that are oftentimes erased from curricula. I think that many of us grow up feeling like we don't have a history. And I think that that can be very dangerous, because if you don't know where you come from and who your people are, and who you are, then how are you able to move forward? And so I'm very aware of the discrepancies that are at play in our educational systems, K through 12 as well as college, in terms of who has the privilege of knowing oneself, who has the privilege of knowing about one's history, and whose histories have been systematically denied to them, whether through either omission or through degradation and stereotyping of those pasts. And so I think that it's, for me, a very important thing to bring this curriculum to Cornell students, and not only that, but to the Ithaca community, because we're certainly not learning about this in high school, and we're not learning about it in middle school or in elementary school. And so I am hoping that this can be a project for us to all learn something about ourselves, even for those of us who are not necessarily of Latin American or Latinx background. I think that some of the themes that have arisen from these artworks are speaking to many of us at many different levels.